My name is Lily Carter. I am 28 years old, a successful tech startup founder, and CEO of Carter Digital Solutions in Austin, Texas. The sound of my stepfather's voice cracking on the word, please, made my coffee taste like ash, even though I hadn't taken a sip yet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, I could see him standing in the parking lot below, his shoulders hunched against the Texas heat, clutching a manila folder like it might save his life. 12 years since he'd thrown that crumpled $7 bill at my feet and called me useless, and now Richard Blackwood was here to beg me for a job. The irony was so perfect, it almost hurt. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're hooked already, a like and subscribe will keep these stories coming. My assistant knocked on the door, her voice muffled through the glass. Miss Carter, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. I set down my coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the marble desk with a sound like dice being thrown. Send him up. The elevator ride would take exactly 43 seconds. I'd timed it once back when I was still climbing my way up from nothing, when every second in this building felt stolen. Now, I own the building, own the company, owned everything Richard had once told me I'd never be smart enough to understand. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. The door opened, and there he was, Richard Blackwood, 58 years old, wearing a suit that had seen better days, and carrying himself like a man who'd forgotten how to stand tall. His hair was grayer than I remembered, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same cold blue that had looked right through me for most of my childhood. Lily! He stepped into my office like he was walking into a church, his voice careful and respectful in a way that made my skin crawl. Thank you for seeing me. Sit down, Richard. He flinched at the use of his first name. Good. For 18 years, he'd made me call him sir in his house, even though he'd never legally adopted me, even though he'd made it clear every day that I was just baggage that came with my mother. He sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where Fortune 500 CEOs had pitched me deals worth millions. The leather creaked under his weight, and I caught a whiff of something I remembered from childhood, Old Spice cologne mixed with the faint smell of motor oil. He'd always worked on cars in the garage back when he'd owned Blackwood Auto Repair, and thought he was king of his small corner of the world. I know this is awkward, he began, his hands fidgeting with the folder. But I heard you were hiring for a shop manager position. I am. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. Tell me about your qualifications. The question hung in the air between us like a blade. We both knew his qualifications. We both knew why he was here. Blackwood Auto Repair had gone under 6 months ago, crushed by debt and bad decisions, and the kind of arrogance that made a man think he could run a business the same way he'd run it in 1995. I bought it at auction for $37,000, less than what I spent on my car. I have 40 years of experience in automotive repair, he said, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. I built Blackwood Auto from nothing, ran it successfully for... Successfully? I interrupted. Is that what you call filing for bankruptcy? His face flushed red, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old Richard, the one who'd never let anyone question his authority. But it passed quickly, replaced by the desperate humility of a man who had no other options. I made some mistakes, he admitted. The economy changed. Competition increased. I should have adapted faster. You should have. I opened my laptop and pulled up his file, even though I'd memorized every detail weeks ago. It says here you were 3 months behind on rent when you closed. Your equipment was repossessed. You owed money to 17 different suppliers. Yes. And before that, you had 3 employees quit in 6 months. Poor management, according to their exit interviews. His jaw tightened. People don't want to work hard anymore. Or maybe they don't want to work for someone who treats them like they're worthless. I closed the laptop and looked at him directly. Tell me, Richard, what makes you think you'd be a good fit for my company? The question was a trap, and we both knew it. How could he answer without acknowledging what he'd done to me? How could he sell himself to the girl he'd spent years tearing down? I know I wasn't always fair to you when you were younger, he said, finally, the words coming out like they were being pulled from him with pliers. But I've learned from my mistakes. I'm ready to work hard, follow orders, be part of a team. Follow orders. I repeated the words, slowly tasting them. From me. Yes. The girl you said would never amount to anything. His face went pale. Lily, the girl you called useless when she asked for help with college applications. I was wrong. The girl you gave $7 to when she aged out of your house and told her it was more than she deserved. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming, could hear the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. Richard's hands were clenched in his lap, his knuckles white with tension. I was wrong about everything, he whispered. I know that now. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city I'd conquered through sheer force of will and spite. Austin sprawled out below me, all glass and steel and possibility, nothing like the small town where I'd grown up feeling small and worthless and invisible. Do you remember what you said to me the day I left? I asked without turning around. Lily, do you remember? A long pause. Then, I said you'd be back within a month, begging for help. And what else? I said. His voice broke. I said you were too stupid and too weak to make it on your own. I turned around, and for the first time since he'd walked into my office, I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. You were half right, I said. I did come back, but I'm not begging. I walked back to my desk and sat down, pulling out a standard employment contract. The position pays $15 an hour. No benefits for the first 90 days. You'll report to Jake Martinez, who's 24 years old and has been with the company for 2 years. You'll work weekends and holidays as needed. And you'll address me as Ms. Carter at all times. Richard stared at the contract like it was written in a foreign language. $15 an hour? That's more than minimum wage. You should be grateful. But you were making nothing, Richard, because your business failed. I slid the contract across the desk. This is what I'm offering. Take it or leave it. He picked up the contract with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the terms. I watched him read, watched him realize that this wasn't just a job offer. It was a complete reversal of power. The man who had once controlled every aspect of my life was now completely at my mercy. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out another document. A non-disclosure agreement. You'll agree never to discuss our personal history with other employees. As far as they're concerned, you're just another hire. Why? Because I don't want my employees to know I'm related to someone who failed so spectacularly at business. The words were cruel, and I meant them to be. Sign both documents, or the offer is withdrawn. Richard's hand hovered over the papers, a pen trembling between his fingers. I could see the war playing out on his face, pride versus desperation, anger versus need. He was 58 years old with no savings, no prospects, and a reputation in ruins. This job was probably his only chance to avoid losing his house. I need this job, he said quietly. I know. I'll sign. Good. I watched him scrawl his signature on both documents, each letter a small victory in a war that had started when I was 10 years old, and he'd first looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. He finished signing and looked up at me, his eyes hollow. When do I start? Monday, 7 a.m. sharp. Jake will show you around, explain your duties. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Don't be late, Richard, I don't tolerate tardiness. He stood as well, clutching the folder he'd brought like a security blanket. Lily, I want you to know. Miss Carter. Miss Carter, I want you to know that I'm grateful for this opportunity. You should be. He walked toward the door, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Just before he reached it, he turned back. I know I don't have the right to ask, he said, but is there any chance we could try to rebuild our relationship? I know I was a terrible stepfather, but maybe. No, the word came out flat and final. You're an employee now, Richard. Nothing more. His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like an old man who'd lost everything that mattered, which I supposed he had. After he left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the signed contracts. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt empty, like I'd won a game that nobody else wanted to play. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. Your mother called. She wants to have dinner this weekend to discuss the Richard situation. Should I schedule something? I stared at the message, my blood running cold. My mother knew Richard was working for me, which meant she'd been in contact with him, which meant there were conversations happening behind my back. Conversations about me. I was still processing this when my office door burst open without a knock. My assistant stumbled in, her face pale, with panic. Miss Carter, I'm so sorry, but there's a woman here who says she's your mother, and she won't take no for an answer, and she's making a scene in the lobby. Behind her, pushing past security like they were made of paper, was my mother, Patricia Blackwood, 55 years old, and still beautiful in the way that had made men fall all over themselves to take care of her. She wore a designer dress I'd probably paid for, and an expression I remembered from childhood, the look she got when she was about to choose Richard over me. Again, "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to talk." My mother closed the office door behind her with the soft click of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of making dramatic entrances. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral that I'd bought her for Christmas, filled the room like a cloud of guilt and manipulation. She moved through my office like she owned it, her heels silent on the thick carpet, her eyes taking in every detail of my success with the calculating gaze of someone pricing items at an estate sale. "Patricia!" I didn't stand up, didn't offer her a seat. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" She settled into the chair Richard had just vacated, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. "I called 3 times this week. You haven't returned any of my messages. I've been busy." "Too busy for your mother?" Her voice carried that familiar note of wounded innocence that had worked so well on Richard, on every man she'd ever wrapped around her finger. "Too busy to discuss what you're doing to Richard." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. She looked good for 55, better than good, actually. The spa treatments and personal trainer I'd been paying for had done their job. But there was something brittle around her eyes, something desperate in the way she held herself. "What I'm doing to Richard?" I repeated. "You mean giving him a job when no one else would?" "You know, that's not what I mean." She opened her purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually wet. "Lily, honey, I know you're angry about the past, but this has gone too far." "Has it? $15 an hour? For a man with 40 years of experience." Her voice rose slightly, the careful control slipping. "He's your stepfather, Lily. He raised you. He tolerated me. There's a difference. He provided for you. He put a roof over your head, food on your table. He did the bare minimum required by law because you made him." I stood up and walked to the window, needing distance from her perfume and her lies. "And he made sure I knew every day that I was a burden he didn't want to carry. You were a difficult child." The words hit me like a slap, even though I'd been expecting them. My mother had always been good at rewriting history, at making my pain disappear with a few carefully chosen words. I was 10 years old when you married him, I said without turning around. I was grieving my father, trying to adjust to a new home, a new family. And instead of helping me, you chose to side with the man who made it clear I wasn't welcome. Richard was trying to establish boundaries. Richard was trying to erase me. I turned back to face her, and she flinched at whatever she saw in my expression. Do you remember the college fund, Patricia? The one Dad left for me. Her face went pale. That money was needed for household expenses. That money was mine. Dad specifically left it for my education, and you let Richard convince you to spend it on his business. I walked back to my desk, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest. $12,000. Gone. Because Richard said I probably wouldn't go to college anyway. We were going to pay it back. With what? The business that just went bankrupt. I sat down and pulled out my laptop, opening a file I'd hoped I'd never have to use. Do you want to know how I really built this company, Patricia? Do you want to know what those first few years were like? She didn't answer, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew she didn't want to hear this story. I worked 3 jobs, I continued, my voice steady and cold. Waitressing at night, data entry during the day, and cleaning offices on weekends. I lived in a studio apartment with no air conditioning and ate ramen noodles for dinner because that's all I could afford. I taught myself to code using library computers because I couldn't afford my own laptop. Lily, I slept 4 hours a night for 2 years while I built my first app. I pitched it to 47 investors before someone finally said yes. And you know what kept me going through all of that? The memory of Richard throwing $7 at me and telling me it was more than I deserved. My mother was crying now, real tears this time, but I felt nothing, no sympathy, no regret, no desire to comfort her. I turned that $7 into a 7-figure company. I said, and now Richard needs me. Now you both need me. And you have the audacity to come into my office and tell me I'm being too harsh. He's changed, Lily. He's not the same man he was 12 years ago. Neither am I. She wiped her eyes with the tissue, smearing her makeup. What do you want from us? What will it take for you to forgive him? Forgiveness? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Patricia, I don't want Richard's apology. I don't want his regret or his gratitude or his promises to do better. I want him to understand what it feels like to be powerless. You're torturing him. I'm employing him at a fair wage for someone with his current qualifications. His current qualifications. Her voice cracked. He's a master mechanic. He's a failed business owner with no references and a bankruptcy on his record. I closed my laptop and looked at her directly. In today's job market, $15 an hour is generous. This isn't about money, and you know it. You're right. It's about justice. It's about revenge. Sometimes they're the same thing. We stared at each other across my desk, 12 years of unspoken resentment hanging in the air between us. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out what angle would work, what combination of guilt and manipulation would make me back down. What about me? She asked finally. What about our relationship? What relationship? You chose Richard over me every time it mattered. When he said I couldn't have friends over because I was too loud. When he said I didn't deserve a car for my 16th birthday because I hadn't earned it. When he said I was wasting money on college applications because I'd never get in anywhere good. I was trying to keep the peace. You were being a coward. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. You let him treat me like garbage because it was easier than standing up to him. I loved him. More than you loved me. She flinched like I'd hit her. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my life, my work, my happiness? The only time I hear from you is when you need money or when Richard needs something. That's not. When's my birthday, Patricia? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It's in March. April 15th. I shook my head. You don't even know when your own daughter was born. I've been under a lot of stress. For 12 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of her crying. Real, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. I watched her fall apart and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. I know I wasn't a perfect mother, she said through her tears. I know I made mistakes. But Lily, you're all I have left. Richard and we're not doing well. The bankruptcy, the stress, it's destroying us. And now this job, the way you're treating him, it's making everything worse. How is it making things worse? He comes home every day humiliated. He barely speaks to me. He sits in his chair and stares at the wall like he's given up on everything. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. He's talking about leaving town, starting over somewhere else. Good. Maybe he'll find somewhere that appreciates failed business owners with anger management issues. Lily, please. I'm begging you. If you won't forgive him for his sake, do it for mine. I can't lose both of you. You lost me 12 years ago when you chose him over me. This is just you finally noticing. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Fine. If that's how you want it, fine. But don't expect me to watch you destroy the man I love just because you can't let go of the past. I'm not destroying him. I'm employing him. You're humiliating him. He's humiliating himself. I'm just providing the venue. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. Just before she reached it, she turned back. You know what the saddest part is, she said. You've become exactly like him. Cold, cruel, incapable of forgiveness. Congratulations, Lily. You've turned into the person you hate most. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone with the echo of her words and the lingering scent of her perfume. I sat in the silence for a long time, trying to process what she'd said, trying to decide if there was any truth in it. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake Martinez, my shop manager. Hey, boss, got a weird situation here. Your new hire, Richard, showed up 3 hours early and has been sitting in the parking lot ever since. Should I send him home? I looked at the time. It was only 4 p.m., and Richard wasn't supposed to start until Monday morning. But there he was, sitting in his car in my parking lot like a lost dog waiting for someone to let him in. I texted back, let him sit. If he wants to waste his time, that's his choice. But even as I sent the message, I found myself walking back to the window, looking down at the parking lot. Richard's car was a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and rust around the wheel wells. He sat behind the wheel with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the building like it held the answers to all his problems. He looked small, defeated, nothing like the man who had once made me feel like I was taking up too much space in his world. I was still watching him when my assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Carter, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. I'm not taking any more meetings today. She says she's from the IRS. My blood ran cold. I turned away from the window, my mind racing. The IRS? I'd been meticulous about my taxes, had hired the best accountants money could buy. There was no reason for them to be here. Unless, send her in, I said. The woman who entered my office was young, maybe 30, with short blonde hair, and the kind of serious expression that meant trouble. She wore a dark suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it weighed more than she did. Ms. Carter, I'm Agent Sarah Williams with the Internal Revenue Service. I need to ask you some questions about your recent business acquisition. Which acquisition? Blackwood Auto Repair. Specifically, the circumstances surrounding the auction and your relationship to the previous owner. My heart stopped. What about it? Agent Williams opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We have reason to believe that the bankruptcy filing was fraudulent and that you may have been involved in a scheme to artificially depress the business's value before purchasing it at auction. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. I had nothing to do with Richard's bankruptcy. Richard Blackwood, your stepfather. She consulted her notes. Who is now employed by your company at significantly below market wages. He's employed at the wages I choose to pay him. Ms. Carter, we have evidence that suggests you may have used your business connections to sabotage Mr. Blackwood's company, forcing him into bankruptcy so you could acquire his assets at a fraction of their true value. I stared at her, my mind reeling. What evidence? Financial records showing unusual patterns in his supplier relationships. Testimony from former employees suggesting outside interference. And most damning of all, she pulled out a document and placed it on my desk. A signed statement from Mr. Blackwood himself, alleging that you orchestrated his business failure as an act of revenge. I looked down at the document, and there it was, Richard's signature at the bottom of a statement accusing me of destroying his life. The man I just hired had just accused me of a federal crime. The document felt like poison between my fingers as I read Richard's statement. Each word, a carefully crafted lie designed to destroy everything I'd built. The smell of Agent Williams' cheap perfume mixed with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like a drum counting down to my execution. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Austin, the first drops of rain already streaking down my office windows. This is complete fiction, I said, setting the statement down with hands that barely trembled. Richard Blackwood is a failed businessman looking for someone to blame for his own mistakes. Agent Williams pulled out a recording device and placed it on my desk. Do you mind if I record this conversation? Actually, I do mind, and I'd like my lawyer present before we continue. That's your right, of course. But Ms. Carter, I should tell you that we have more than just Mr. Blackwood's statement. She opened her briefcase again, pulling out bank records, phone logs, email printouts. We have evidence of communications between your company and several of Mr. Blackwood's suppliers, communications that occurred weeks before his bankruptcy filing. My stomach dropped. There had been communications, but not for the reasons she was suggesting. I'd been researching the auto repair industry, looking into potential acquisitions. It was standard business practice, completely legal. I research all my investments thoroughly. I said, that's not a crime. It is when that research involves convincing suppliers to change their payment terms, making it impossible for a struggling business to maintain cash flow. Agent Williams spread the documents across my desk like she was dealing cards. It's also a crime when you use inside information to time your acquisition perfectly. Inside information? Information provided by someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Blackwood's financial situation. Someone who knew exactly when he would be forced to file for bankruptcy. She leaned forward, her eyes cold and calculating. Someone like his stepdaughter, who had access to his personal and business affairs through family connections. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't see. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Phone records showing calls between my office and Richard's suppliers. Email exchanges about payment terms and credit limits. Bank transfers that looked suspicious when viewed through the lens of a federal investigation. I never had access to Richard's business affairs. I said, "We haven't spoken in 12 years. Haven't you?" Agent Williams pulled out another document. Phone records show 17 calls between your personal cell phone and Mr. Blackwood's business line over the past 8 months. I stared at the phone log, my mind racing. 17 calls? That was impossible. I hadn't called Richard once since I'd left his house 12 years ago. Those calls never happened. I said, the phone company says otherwise. Then someone else made them. Someone with access to my phone, or someone spoofing my number. Ms. Carter, I understand this is difficult, but the evidence is quite clear. You used your business resources and family connections to systematically destroy Mr. Blackwood's company, then purchased it at auction for a fraction of its value. That's conspiracy, fraud, and potentially racketeering. The words hit me like physical blows. Conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, federal crimes that could put me in prison for decades, destroy my company, ruin everything I'd worked for. I want my lawyer, I said again. Of course. But Ms. Carter, I should mention that we're prepared to offer you a deal. Full cooperation in our investigation, including testimony against any co-conspirators, in exchange for reduced charges. Co-conspirators. We believe you didn't act alone. Someone helped you access Mr. Blackwood's financial information, someone with intimate knowledge of his business operations. Agent Williams gathered up the documents, her movements precise and practiced, someone who had as much reason to want him to fail as you did. The implication was clear, and it made my blood run cold. They thought my mother was involved. They thought Patricia had helped me destroy Richard's business. My mother had nothing to do with this, I said. Are you sure about that? Because our investigation suggests otherwise. Agent Williams stood up, closing her briefcase with a sharp click. Think about it, Ms. Carter. Think about who benefits from Mr. Blackwood's downfall. Think about who had access to the information we found. And think about whether you want to protect someone who may have been using you all along. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. I'll be in touch about scheduling a formal interview. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to leave the city. After she left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the rain that was now coming down in sheets against the windows. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, turning the sky dark and filling the air with the smell of ozone and wet concrete. I could see Richard's car still sitting in the parking lot, water streaming down its windshield like tears. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer, heard from a contact at IRS. They're building a case. We need to talk immediately. I was reaching for my jacket when my office door opened without a knock. Richard walked in, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his head, and his cheap suit dripping water onto my expensive carpet. He looked like a man who'd been standing in the rain for hours, which I realized he probably had been. We need to talk, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Get out of my office. Lily, please. I know what you're thinking, but it's not what it looks like. It looks like you accused me of federal crimes to save your own skin. I didn't have a choice. The words exploded out of him, raw and desperate. They came to me 3 days ago with evidence, with documents, with things I'd never seen before. They said you'd been planning this for months, that you'd use me to get information about my business. And you believe them? I didn't know what to believe. He stepped closer, water dripping from his clothes onto my floor. Lily, they had phone records showing calls from your number to my suppliers. They had emails with your company's signature, conversations about changing payment terms that I never authorized. I stared at him, seeing something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, bone-deep terror. Someone set us both up, he continued. Someone wanted my business to fail, wanted you to buy it, wanted us to destroy each other in the process. Who? I don't know, but I have an idea. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wet manila folder. I found these in Patricia's things when I went home to pack. He spread the contents across my desk. Bank statements showing large deposits into my mother's account. Copies of emails between Patricia and Richard's suppliers. Phone records showing calls from her number to mine, calls that had been made while I was in meetings and couldn't have answered. "She's been using your phone," Richard said quietly. "Somehow, she's been making calls from your number, impersonating you to my suppliers. And she's been feeding information to someone who paid her very well for it." I picked up one of the bank statements, my hands shaking. $50,000 deposited into my mother's account 2 weeks before Richard's bankruptcy filing. Another $25,000 the day after I bought his business at auction. "Why?" I whispered. "Because she's been planning this for years. Ever since your company started making real money." Richard sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk, looking older than his 58 years. "Lily, I think she's been setting us up to destroy each other, so she could inherit everything when the dust settled." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. My mother's sudden interest in reconciliation. Her knowledge of Richard's job interview. Her dramatic appearance in my office just hours after he'd signed his employment contract. She knew about the IRS investigation. I said, "She probably triggered it, fed them just enough information to make them suspicious, then sat back and watched us tear each other apart." I thought about my mother's words earlier. "You've become exactly like him. Cold, cruel, incapable of forgiveness." She'd been trying to drive a wedge between us, trying to make sure we'd never compare notes, never figure out what she'd done. "The phone calls," I said. "How did she make calls from my number?" "Spoofing apps. You can download them for $20 and make calls that show up as coming from any number you want." Richard wiped rain from his face with the back of his hand. "She's been playing us against each other for months, maybe years." My phone rang, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. I looked at Richard, and he nodded. "Answer it," he said, "but put it on speaker." I accepted the call and hit the speaker button. "Hello, Patricia. Lily, sweetheart, I just heard the most terrible news. Someone told me the IRS was at your office today." Her voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not surprised. "I hope everything's all right." "How did you hear about that?" "Oh, you know how news travels in business circles. I'm sure it's just a routine audit or something." A pause. "Unless, oh no, this isn't about Richard, is it? About you hiring him?" I looked at Richard, seeing my own realization reflected in his eyes. She was fishing, trying to find out how much we knew. Why would it be about Richard? I asked, "Well, I just worry that people might misunderstand your motives. Hiring your stepfather after his business failed, paying him so little, it might look like you're taking advantage of him. Or it might look like I'm helping him." "Of course, sweetheart. I'm sure that's all it is." Another pause, longer this time. "Lily, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe we could all sit down together, work things out as a family. All of us. You, me, and Richard. Clear the air, start fresh." Her voice was warm, motherly, completely convincing. "What do you say? Dinner tomorrow night? My treat." I looked at Richard, who was shaking his head frantically. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," I said. "Oh." The warmth in her voice flickered, just for a moment. "Well, maybe when things settle down, after this IRS business is resolved." "How do you know it needs to be resolved? I thought you said it was just a routine audit." Silence on the other end. "Then I just meant, well, these things can be stressful, can't they? Even when there's nothing to worry about." "Patricia, where are you right now?" "At home, of course." "Why?" I walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot. Through the rain, I could see a figure sitting in a car across the street, talking on a phone. "Are you sure about that?" The line went dead. I turned to Richard, who was staring at the phone with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "She's been watching us," he said, "probably for months, making sure her plan worked. What do we do now?" "We go to the FBI. We tell them everything, show them the evidence." He stood up, water still dripping from his clothes. "And we hope they believe us instead of her." "Richard," I stopped him as he reached for the door. "Why are you helping me? After everything I've done to you, why are you trying to save me?" He turned back, and for the first time since I'd known him, his expression was completely open, completely honest. "Because I was wrong about you," he said simply. "I was wrong about everything. And because maybe if we work together, we can both survive what she's done to us." I nodded, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something like understanding. "There's one more thing," I said. "The job offer. $15 an hour." "What about it?" "I'm changing it. 25 an hour, full benefits, and a signing bonus to cover your legal fees." I managed a small smile. Consider it hazard pay for having Patricia as a mother-in-law. For the first time in 12 years, Richard Blackwood smiled at me. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, and through the clearing clouds, I could see the first hints of sunlight breaking through. We had a long fight ahead of us, a battle against someone who had spent years planning our destruction. But for the first time since this whole nightmare, 3 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where my mother was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and identity theft. The FBI had found evidence of similar schemes targeting other wealthy families, a pattern of manipulation, and betrayal that stretched back years. Richard and I sat together in the gallery, not as family, but as survivors of the same storm. We'd both been cleared of all charges, our names restored, our lives slowly rebuilding from the wreckage Patricia had left behind. The $7 Richard had given me 12 years ago was framed on my office wall now, not as a symbol of his cruelty, but as a reminder of how far we'd both come. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most aren't the ones we think they are. And sometimes the only way to heal is to stop fighting each other and start fighting for each other instead. Richard still worked for me, but as a partner now, helping me expand into automotive services. We weren't a family. That trust would take years to rebuild, if it ever could be, but we were something better. We were allies who had learned that survival sometimes means forgiving the person you thought was your enemy so you can face the real threat together. The rain had stopped and the sun was shining. It was enough.